Good afternoon and welcome to the Division 39 webinar entitled Minding Emotions. Please note, all participants are muted throughout the webinar. You can submit your questions using the Questions tab during the webinar. However, questions will be answered within the last 15 minutes of the presentation. And now we will have an introduction of the speaker by Dr. Chris Christian. Dr. Christian?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of a series of webinars hosted by the Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Studies, Division 39 of APA. The focus of this webinar series is on translating research findings to clinical work. And we're delighted to launch this series with the work of Dr. Elliot, Jurist, who I'm pleased to introduce next. Dr. Jurist is a professor in the PhD program of clinical psychology at City College of New York, and professor of philosophy at the Graduate Center of CUNY. His new book, Minding Emotions, published by Guilford Press, will be the basis of today's webinar. Dr. Jurist is also the author of Affect Regulation, Mentalization, and the Development of Self, published by the Other Press, and is the former editor of Psychoanalytic Psychology. Following Dr. Jurist's presentation, we will have time for a Q&A. You can submit any questions as we go along using the question box. We may not get to all the questions, but we will do our best. Dr. Jurist will be presenting PowerPoint by audio only. During the Q&A, however, Dr. Jurist will join us on screen. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Jurist.
Thank you very much, Chris. Let me begin by expressing my gratitude to Chris Christian, who's the editor of Psychoanalytic Psychology, and to the moderator today. Also to the leadership of Division 39, the appropriate sponsor for this talk, since I will be articulating a psychoanalytic approach to practice, although I would also like to note that all psychotherapeutic approaches value emotions as central to the work. I'd also like to thank the audience members and welcome them to eat lunch as I speak. People seek out psychotherapy, phenomenologically speaking, because they are either too much in touch or out of touch with emotions. Too much in touch with emotions can feel like being stuck or being overwhelmed by feelings, especially negative feelings like fear or anger or sadness. Too little in touch with feelings can seem like avoiding feelings, especially negative feelings like fear or anger or sadness, but it's also possible to avoid positive feelings as well. Let's add a third possibility, that is being confused about feelings. I have termed this operatic feelings in my book, which occur when we know we feel something, but we are not sure what it is, and our effort to fathom those feelings seems difficult or overwhelming or impossible. Oops. My slides are not moving. Okay, my phenomenological descriptions overlap with other existing languages, like defenses, which can be either too permeable or too rigid, like personality, which can be internalizing towards the self versus externalizing away from the self, or insecure attachment, the ambivalent style being underregulated with emotions and avoidant being overregulated. There are also links to various forms of psychopathology. Too much in touch with emotions can be found in the rumination that's associated with depression, and being out of touch can be associated with schizoid phenomena. Operatic feelings do not fit into the categories of excess, too much, or deficiency, too little. They occur for everyone, and certainly not just for people who are seeking psychotherapy. What I have in mind is differentiated from alexithymia in the sense that operatic feelings are situational and occasional. In eluding certainty, operatic feelings invite ongoing reflection. And it is possible through effort to help them become more granular, but this is not necessarily the case, always. Operatic feelings provide an opportunity to be jointly curious about emotions, opening a path for patients to be receptive to receiving help from a therapist, which I'll try to illustrate as I go on. So my title, Minding Emotions, which is the same as the book that Dr. Christian mentioned that was published in 2018. My focus here will be a little limited because of time constraints. But what is meant by that is a desirable way for therapists to help patients make better use of their emotions. More specifically, we could think of the connotations of minding emotions in terms of leading emotions from the body into the mind, paying attention to emotions, making emotions more intelligible, taking care of emotions, being bothered by emotions, or all of the above. So my argument today really will be that minding emotions means helping patients to be able to mentalize emotions through the mechanism which I term mentalized affectivity. So my agenda today will be as follows. I will begin with a broad and general discussion of emotion and emotion regulation in order to be able to locate my work on mentalized affectivity. Then I will move on to the effort to operationalize mentalized affectivity, which my research team has done in the mentalized affectivity scale. And I'll really be focusing on applying results to enable therapists to foster the capacity for patients to better mentalize their emotions. I will conclude with some clinical examples as illustrations of how to work with emotions in psychotherapy. An ultimate aim is to demonstrate how we can derive tools from research to help therapists work with patients' emotions. I will describe my research selectively and not in great detail, but in a panel on at the spring meeting of Division 39 coming up in a few weeks in Philadelphia, I will be presenting the research more fully. So let's begin by broadening the frame a bit and think about emotions in psychoanalysis. This actually has a fairly complicated history, which I've written about in a couple of articles. But I would say that beginning with Freud, there's a way in which emotions are minimized by being seen as discharge phenomena, and an insistence that we think about emotions as being secondary to drives. This changes over the course of Freud's work when he begins to recognize the greater importance of emotions and, for example, describes what he terms signal affects, which actually create meaning. But I would like to emphasize a kind of paradox in that emotions elude control by the ego, yet the ego does have a role in modulating their expression. And also, we should not forget that emotions have always had a central place in the clinical work of psychoanalysis. So there has been a kind of discrepancy between theory and practice. I also would like to highlight a particularly fascinating idea that is introduced through the idea of signal affects, namely that symbolic affects help us to be able to pursue a creative life. This is so important because I think it marks a higher ambition for psychotherapy beyond symptom relief. And I would say it coincides with well-being to a certain extent, but it's also important that we're not just talking about optimizing or maximizing positive emotions. In my book, I try to illustrate this with the two autobiographies of Oliver Sacks, where he works through the trauma of being transplanted from home because of the London bombing in World War II, and then rejection by his mother because of his homosexuality. He uses the metaphor of family members as metals. Perhaps many of you know that Oliver Sacks was in psychoanalysis with the same analyst for, I think, 44 years, really up until his death. Now, let me broaden the frame even further by talking about a longer history of emotions. And we can begin with a fundamental contrast between Aristotle or Aristotelians and Stoic philosophers. Aristotle believed that emotions can be educated and subjected to an ideal sense of agency. So it's an affirmation, really, of the idea of regulation. Compared to the Stoics, who believe that emotions, by definition, overwhelm and lead us astray. Now, Spinoza offered a kind of compromise solution to this fundamental contrast by saying that both are right, in the sense that it's never such a good thing to act in the heat of emotion when it is most aroused, but that it's really crucial also to learn from emotions as well. And I would say, in general, that in Western culture, emotions have been regarded as suspect, located on the inferior side of the dichotomy with reason, in a way that's parallel to the distinction between the mind and the body, spirit and nature, and gender between men and women. There's a profound shift that occurs in the 19th century with Charles Darwin, who proposed that emotions are universal, biological, and exist across species and are manifest in facial expressions. Darwin doesn't particularly stress the theme of communication, but I think this is perhaps one of the more important implications of his point of view. So this perspective has been developed in terms of the idea of basic emotions, or the basic emotions paradigm, namely that through evolution, emotions have become universal, hardwired, they occur briefly and transparently, and they can be recognized cross-culturally through facial expressions. There's some variation in terms of the number of basic emotions, but a typical range is fear, anger, sadness, disgust, joy, or being happy, and surprise. This is from the work of Paul Ekman. And Ekman's research, which has become incredibly important as a basis of thinking about emotions in psychology, is based upon asking subjects to be able to match words to pictures with a limited range of choices of words. And I would like to observe that this really is profoundly different than asking someone about what the emotion means in the particular culture in which they live, or more generally just saying, what are the most important emotions in your culture? Now, there have been several critiques of basic emotions along the lines of what I've already suggested. In a really important recent work, Lisa Feldman Barrett argues that the effort to link basic emotions to the brain have not been particularly successful. She also cites the work of a graduate student of hers about a Namibian tribe that was chosen because of their remoteness from Western culture, in which emotions are understood as predictors of actions, but not really in terms of being mental states. So this is where Barrett argues that we should have a better appreciation of the way in which emotions are constructed. Now, there are a few other critiques of basic emotions which I'd like to mention. The first is by James Russell, who has argued that culture is really deeper than display rules. It's not something just sort of added onto the so-called basic emotions. And he points out, for example, that the meaning of an emotion might be similar across cultures, but that doesn't mean it's identical, and that it can even have different connotations that should not be ignored. We also have the issue that some emotion words exist in one culture but not in another, which of course creates issues having to do with translation. One further critique of basic emotions is the idea that dimensions are actually more basic than so-called basic emotions. For example, we could think of valences of pleasure and unpleasure that really underlie all the different kinds of emotions we can think about. So, can we continue to consider emotion in terms of biological evolution following Darwin, helping us to adapt to our environment, fostering cooperation, and negotiating competition? Well, it is a positive thing that we have a system of facial expressions because they are observable and measurable. But it also is important to not abandon philosophical questions which would have to push us about not simply assuming that what we know can infer about subjective experience based upon facial expressions. I think we also need to consider the deep and abiding influence of culture, that it's not just equivalent to topsoil. We know there's a fundamental difference between cultures that value independence versus interdependence. And some recent research has suggested that there are really profound cultural differences concerning positive emotions, where in Western culture, there is a hope to be able to savor it, whereas in East Asian culture, really invites dampening of positive emotions. Moreover, I think it's important to throw in the mix that globalism counters cultural differences, but at the same time, it produces new hybrid forms. So we need to pay more attention, not just to having emotions, but to what they mean and how they're supposed to be utilized. So let me turn to talk about the idea of emotion regulation. First of all, this is anticipated in psychoanalytic ideas such as affect taming and affect handling. It was taken up in developmental psychology to mean specifically a restriction of negative emotions that is very closely linked to socialization itself. I worry about thinking about emotion regulation in those terms because of its potential to serve as a normalizing doctrine, which I think in the end sort of rewards people who are already privileged. There's also an interesting consideration of something along the lines of what James Baldwin proposed, which is that rage is the appropriate response to white racism. So that would be an example of the importance of regulating negative affect to be increased rather than in a downward direction. Most of the research on emotion regulation has focused on strategies, for example, appraisal versus suppression. My work has been in the direction of considering the role of emotion regulation in developing and enhancing a sense of agency. Dr. Christian referred to the book Affect Regulation, Mentalization, and the Development of the Self from 2002. In any case, emotion regulation is really a huge growth industry across all subfields of psychology. And I'll illustrate this with the slide that shows in every 5 years the proliferating references in PsycInfo to the idea of emotion regulation. So let me briefly discuss two prominent models of emotion regulation: the process and the mindfulness models. The process model by James Gross sequentially moves through a situation in which attention is given and then an appraisal and a response. I think it's the most crucial element of this has to do with the cognitive appraisal. In Gross's more recent work, he's kind of added an additional factor that has to do with what he calls valuation. But this way of thinking about emotion regulation is that it's an online process. I wonder who or what is the source of directing the appraisals, which is not well addressed in that perspective. And I also would question whether there needs to be an initial situation if we think about something like someone beginning from having a memory pass through their minds. The mindfulness model, and this is really, the idea of linking mindfulness to emotion regulation, which is the project of Shapiro, who emphasizes the idea of reperceiving. Reperceiving requires us to be able to observe without judging. The aim really has to do with accepting emotions. We should notice that this is reflective, not necessarily situational. Has to do with tuning into internal experience. But I think we have the same question about the role of the self. And I would say that the closer a mindfulness model is to contemplative traditions, the more ambivalence it has about the self, in the sense that there can be a hope to transcend the self to some larger state of consciousness. So let me introduce the idea of mentalized affectivity. There are several premises of a psychoanalytic way of thinking about emotion regulation. First, that it's an implicit, not necessarily explicit process. That it's influenced by past history and experience, or what we can call autobiographical memory. And in my book, one of the things that I tried to do is to integrate the different literatures on emotion regulation and on autobiographical memory and narrative. It's also not a matter of cognition prevailing over emotion. I think there's a kind of different ratio in which that has to do with revaluing the emotion. So in many ways, I think the term modulation captures better what I'm trying to describe than regulation, especially the connotation of modulation that comes from music, in which it's a blending of things rather than having one prevail over the other. The other really critical idea of underlying a psychoanalytic approach to emotion regulation is that it's integrally related to the self. And this makes it quite distinct from either the process or mindfulness models. And based upon hypothesizing different components of emotional experience, we can try to delineate how a sense of agency really emerges. I would link identifying emotions to be the inception of a sense of agency, particularly insofar as that includes kind of wondering about why one has a hard time feeling angry, or why someone tends to feel angry too easily. And the second is processing, or this in my mind is equivalent to modulating, where there's some kind of actualization of agency to make the emotion fit what you see as desirable. So this is where we have sort of the adjustment of the emotion either upwards or downwards, or remaining the same. Expressing emotions, I would see in terms of the realization of agency. In my book, I differentiate between what I call the inward expression of emotion and the external expression of emotion, because it's not always the case that expressing is a desirable thing. But it can be important to fully experience the emotion, regardless of whether one reveals it in the external world. But here we're getting into that human agency does have a lot to do with the ability to communicate. So mentalized affectivity, I think I would say, should improve through psychotherapy, but I also want to be cautious about not kind of claiming that it's the exclusive aim of psychotherapy. Mentalized affectivity, in a way that I haven't yet tried to describe, depends on how one mentalizes. And that's mentalizing both by the therapist and the patient. So let me say a word on the idea of mentalization. This is an elusive concept. It can mean different things. I would begin with the idea that it has to do with understanding others in terms of their mental states as opposed to just their physical actions. But it can also have to do with understanding oneself as well. There are two very different sources for the idea of mentalization. French psychosomatic thinkers use the term mentalizing in terms of reading one's own bodily states, where it's really a very strongly affective phenomenon. In theory of mind and cognitive psychology, mentalizing is understood really exclusively in terms of reading the states of other people's minds, and it tends to be strongly cognitive. The originality of the work of Peter Fonagy and colleagues has to do with integrating these two different sources, starting developmentally from the fact that we mentalize from having others mentalize about us. And I would sort of make a refinement here that mentalizing can be about another person, it can be about yourself, but in some ways, mentalizing has to do with using others' knowledge and considering it in relation to oneself. I think it's important to recognize that mentalizing can be retrospective as well as prospective. Ironically, I would say that we often mentalize when we realize belatedly that we ought to have mentalized but did not. And this is where I think we can glimpse how my understanding of mentalized affectivity is compatible with the power of the unconscious. Okay. It's also true that I think it would be mistaken to assume that it's always desirable in life to mentalize. So, why strive for mentalized affectivity? This idea differs from approaches to emotion regulation that do assert that it's the aim of psychotherapy. And I believe that not all emotions can or should be regulated. There's a certain unruliness of having a mind that we shouldn't have the hubris to expect that psychotherapy will transcend. I see mentalized affectivity as a creative challenge where modulating, adjusting our emotions and exercising cognition in a way that allows for emotions to live, that is to be fully experienced and communicated. So it represents the aspiration to be able to cope with whatever happens in life, but it's no assurance that life brings good things. I think the idea gives us a specificity beyond the idea that the relationship determines the outcome of psychotherapy, right? That's an idea that's often invoked as replacing the idea that psychodynamic psychotherapy is merely about insight. The idea of mentalized affectivity is consistent with the intersubjective turn in psychoanalysis, giving up the idea of insight or historical reconstruction or like a final outcome of being well analyzed. I think it is closely related to the idea of an observing ego, but it builds in responsiveness to others in a way that the observing ego does not. Okay? And it stops short of self-knowledge, but it does promote familiarity and comfort with the self. Okay? So I see mentalized affectivity as giving us a new language for what's possible. It's an ongoing process that continues after psychotherapy. encourage us to observe, question, and refashion the self. And it's a way that continues to help us to figure out what is meaningful to us. Okay. As I've suggested, it depends upon the use of autobiographical memory and narrative. So we can see it as mentalized affectivity as a project of self-definition that values the contribution of others. And as a further point, I would say that this would mean incorporating a focus and investment in understanding cultural memory, not just individual memory. So mentalized affectivity would help us experience emotions in a more flexible way. In other words, to be able to amend our experience based upon context. It allows for an expansion of the palette of emotions and potentially for emotions to be deployed symbolically based upon one's history and experience. So I have just given you an elaborate theoretical description of mentalized affectivity. And after getting a lot of feedback about that, it sounds like a great idea, but how do you really know whether something like this exists? My research team created an operationalization of mentalized affectivity in 2017 called the Mentalized Affectivity Scale. And let me just briefly show you a depiction of our model in which there's a flow chart from biological bases to various childhood developmental experiences which produce different capacities to identify or process or express emotions, and then environmental feedback, which also affects that in a loop as well. Our aim was to try to be more comprehensive than other existing measures. In particular, we are interested in how autobiographical memory has an impact on the experience of emotions. And here's a diagram that shows various existing measures and what they encompass, where our aim was to be inclusive of all of these things. So the scale itself is a 60-item self-report measure. It was administered originally to 2,840 online subjects. The results through hierarchical modeling actually showed that identifying, processing, and expressing emotions are robustly distinguished. Okay. In addition to that, subjects who had some kind of psychopathology, like anxiety or mood disorder or personality disorders, were better than so-called normal subjects in identifying emotions, but worse in processing them. Okay, I will try to elaborate on that because it was surprising, maybe less surprising that processing was difficult, but that they seemed to be better than normals in identifying emotions was the thing that was surprising to us. Okay, and this is just a depiction of the distinction between one can see principal component one is identifying with certain questions strongly pulled for that, and then processing in this column, the second column, we can see how this represents the distinct experience, and then finally the third column is expressing emotions over here, which and some of the positive or negatives are just the reverse items. Now, we have been very gratified that the MAS, the Mentalized Affectivity Scale, has been fairly widely embraced so far. It's been translated into Korean, Japanese, Taiwanese, Mandarin, Taiwanese Mandarin, Mandarin, Turkish, Persian, German, Italian, and Spanish. And we actually got very interested in the idea that our scale was being used cross-culturally, and are now embarking on a new research project to investigate the influence on culture on mentalizing and emotion regulation. And this was generated, which is an interesting thing, by the fact that I think we imagined that the idea of expressing emotions was going to be heard as something desirable. And it turns out that in East Asian culture, that is not necessarily the case. So we've actually asked translators to describe where and why they had difficulty in translating the scale. We've also moved on to create a new 12-item version of the scale, which is a paper we're about to submit, which will be easier to administer, and in fact is now being used at the Psychological Center, which is the psychotherapy training clinic run by the CCNY doctoral program. One critical difference, is the fact that therapists, as well as patients, complete the mass, and we hope to soon provide our first really meaningful clinical data. Okay, so let me try to describe the clinical implications of mentalized affectivity. If we want to help patients to improve their capacity for mentalized affectivity, the mass might help track progress as well as locate and define problems. For example, problems with identifying would mean requiring a focus on that, and that can actually be something close to psychoeducation, which is similar to emotion-focused psychotherapy, for example. But it also will mean amending expectations and slowing down a little bit. If someone can identify emotions but has trouble with modulating, this is very common. We want to kind of think about locating precisely where the problem lies, whether it's at work or home or everywhere. If someone can modulate but has trouble with expressing, this tends to be less common, but this is exactly where we would want to keep the factor of culture in mind. Now, we have an important question about whether the categories of identifying, processing, and expressing emotions link to psychotherapy. And as I've mentioned, the results so far are ambiguous. Subjects with all kinds of psychopathology have trouble with processing. However, they did better than controls with identifying. One would have to wonder whether this is an artifact of that presumably people who have a psychopathology have been in therapy. So maybe they are invested in identifying as a result of that. We should also keep in mind, too, that being invested in identifying shouldn't be equated with being able to identify accurately. Okay, so we'd like to continue investigating issues about psychopathology, but also to continue to look at the link between mentalized affectivity and well-being. Again, I would say our ambition is not just to help people not to feel badly, but to feel well and to be able to tolerate feeling badly. So I would like to now introduce some clinical examples, 3 brief vignettes that provide a window into how the mass can illuminate treatment. And I'll be highlighting the idea that operatic emotions serve as a kind of opening. I won't be able to do justice to the complexity of the cases in this context. Ideally, I will stimulate your interest in this approach, which is consistent with a contemporary psychoanalytic point of view in thinking and practice. And I want to emphasize that working with the idea of mentalized affectivity doesn't mean that we're trying to create different human beings, rather stretching and limiting personality to allow for a good life insofar as that's possible. So, clinical vignette number 1. This is a patient who had trouble identifying emotions. The patient is an adolescent boy from a divorced family who lives with his mother in the city and who prefers to focus on what others feel. He gets lost when asking to describe his own feelings, especially when he's upset about something. He has some anxiety symptoms, spends a lot of time in his room, but he also has friends and is a good student. How did I try to help? I worked with the patient to be aware of how confused he often felt, operatic emotions, which helped him to become better at acknowledging feeling frustrated and angry, negative feelings, and to differentiate more from his mother. They were very close, but his mother was also unpredictable, which had the effect of steering his attention to her. I also worked to help him see how his parents' divorce had led him to be more shut down and aversive to emotions. Here's the context. The patient had taken the train out to the suburbs to meet his father. So you took the train up there, and he was not there when the train arrived. How long did you have to wait? Like 25 minutes. That's a specific answer. Yeah, I couldn't believe it. So typical. But it's a new town he's living in, and maybe he still doesn't know the way around so well. You know, I can imagine being upset by this, at least until I heard a little more about what happened. He's under a lot of pressure these days at work with a new home. Okay, but I'm wondering about something. What did he say when you got in the car? You mean about being late? Nothing. He just started to tell me about the plan for the day and about how the renovation was going. Maybe I'm making too much of this, but just out of curiosity, do you remember at all what was going through your mind as you waited for your dad to arrive? Yeah, well, before the divorce, he was my dad, always there, always, I don't know, like he used to be excited about seeing me. So I was not surprised when we see each other now, he wants me to be part of his life. You were not surprised? I know. I mean, I was surprised, but not surprised. I was like maybe disappointed. Clinical vignette number 2. Trouble with modulating. The patient is a high-functioning woman with a demanding job and a husband and 2 children. She's admired at work for keeping a cool head under pressure, but has a short fuse at home, intimidating her family and making the atmosphere uncomfortable. Patient had a strong identification with her father growing up, which led her to feel that she needed to put her career unquestionably first. How did I try to help? We worked on helping her not to put so much pressure on herself, to question what would happen if she made more time for life outside of work, reapportioning her reactions so she could at least allow herself to get upset occasionally at work and could share part of her best self with her family. Context. Patient was reflecting on being proud of how others regard her at work, but begins to question whether she's really liked by them, both her boss and her employees. Zen, but inauthentic? This comment was based on a prior interaction we had had. I know, I mean, at least I am a real human being at home. If only I could find ways, I don't know, of being a little worse at home and a little sweeter at home. My family deserves that. Even the dog deserves this. It's not easy to get that balance right, but it seems that you're more determined to make some changes in order to contribute more positively at home. I wonder how you might try to do that. Yeah, it will be interesting to see if there's anything I can do about to make a difference. Just to begin it, we're trying to do what I really care about. Last Friday, I walked home from work thinking about this, taking some extra time, and it seemed to make a difference in the way I reacted once I entered the door. At least I was able to weather Zach, her 7-year-old son, running, crashing hug with a smile. She laughed a little bit as she said that. Clinical vignette 3, trouble with expressing. A shy, sensitive young woman who was astute about herself and able to work on her emotions, good at identifying and modulating emotions. However, she could be surprisingly inarticulate in reporting her feelings directly, challenging my capacity to take in what she was saying. She was the youngest of three children, her siblings were much older, as well as her parents. How did I try to help? Placing into question her assumptions that I automatically understood what she intended to say to me, encouraging her to monitor others' reactions to her, also helping her to experiment with stating how she feels, practicing in therapy, and doing so with friends and family. Context. Patient saw an old boyfriend over the weekend. I recall that you were hesitant about getting together at all since you broke up and have not been hopeful that things could be rekindled. I know, but you know how I feel about him. I'm not sure that I do. What do you imagine I think? Well, that I do really love him. To be honest, I wasn't aware of that. But what happened? What happened when you met? I did not expect this to happen. I told myself on the way to meet him that I have moved on. But then I don't know. I don't know what happened. We went to this dim sum place. It was my suggestion, and I'd gone there before. The food is not so good, so I don't even know why. It shocked me that he seemed so peaceful, not anxious, and I was relaxed, and the time just flew by. He's very special to me, but aren't I supposed to be enjoying being single again? I recall that you were hesitant about getting together at all, since you broke up and have not been inclined to hope that things could be rekindled. I guess there's a lot that I haven't told you. Okay, let me make some conclusions. I've tried to propose a new psychoanalytic way of thinking about and working with emotions, and there's no reason why this can't be modified for other treatment approaches. More specifically, I've offered a new perspective on emotion regulation, mentalized affectivity. This means that current emotions are viewed through the lens of past history and experience, and this is an integration of emotion regulation, autobiographical memory, and narrative. I tried to alter the top-down emphasis of cognition and affect, a blending of cognition of affect rather than cognition over affect. And it's important to make room for the self, especially the self as agent, although I accept how culture might have an impact on how this is understood. I provided a research-supported distinction amongst identifying, modulating, and expressing emotions. I think this should help us to determine where a patient is and what help he or she needs. About the three vignettes, while diagnoses are possible, they may not be as incisive as focusing on aspects of their emotional experience. 1, problem with identifying, 2, problem with modulating, and 3, problems with expressing, and sketching out journeys to improve mentalized affectivity. I'd like to emphasize again that APORETIC emotions are the opening to a collaborative exploration. So I hope that I'm showing a path of unfolding agency that we expect will influence one's life and well-being. I'd like to thank you for your attention. The webinar will be posted on the Division 39 website if you're interested in seeing the slides. Recall that they will be doing a research session on mentalized affectivity at the spring meeting of Division 39. And feel free to contact me at ejurist5@gmail.com. So I believe now we will turn to take some questions. Dr. Christian?
Yes, thank you, Elliot, for such a stimulating presentation. It really illustrates how research findings can translate into clinical work and vice versa, and then generate, I think, many questions and applications. And so we'll take any questions you may have, if you could type them in on the question box. One question, I'll just start off with one, Elliot, that occurs to me.
Sure.
When you think about the trouble with identifying emotions, you point to a kind of the role of psychoeducation, but the question I think people may have, or I certainly have, is there can clearly be an investment in not wanting to know one's emotions, and I think there's always been an emphasis, traditionally it seems like an emphasis on it being a capacity rather than it serving a function, and in fact there being a defense against kind of tapping
Yeah,
into that emotion. I wonder if you can say a little bit about that.
yeah, okay. I'm gonna hopefully appear. Um, and yeah, that's an excellent question, because it is certainly possible that it's less that one sort of just lacks knowledge about what an emotion means than that one is very uncomfortable with the emotion. So let me sort of start with that. I think, I think I mentioned that emotion-focused therapy really values psychoeducation. And the way that's understood, and I might be wrong about this, but at least my understanding of it is that there are times when the therapist acts like a coach and sort of instructs the patient. And I would say that's not what I really have in mind. That I think what's at stake is finding ways to encourage the patient to, label the emotion which may be avoided, right? I mean, because there are lots of different kind of varieties of like a patient using one emotion over using a single emotion when they mean other emotions. And there's also a way in which someone could sort of like point to emotion but not refer to it directly. So, I would say that, helping someone to be open to identifying emotions would also have to include something about what you hope that they might gain by doing that, right? I mean, to kind of know, to give a specific example of that, if people got angry, all the time at a drop of a hat in a family, that, there are other families in which maybe that was not the case, right? So it does have to do with kind of inspiring some curiosity that has to do with being open to look at one's own history and experience.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to read you some questions that are coming in.
Great.
The one question is there a version of other mentalized affectivity? There seems to be a focus on self-mentalized affectivity, which is great, but I wonder if the problem is in identifying and experiencing them in self may also translate to identifying and understanding in others.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I would like to, let's start from again the more general category of mentalization. Mentalization doesn't have to be mentalizing emotions. You can mentalize beliefs, you can mentalize values. So it's a broader construct. With mentalizing emotions, again, I think we're thinking about the value of trying to sort of understand the impact of, past history on present experience. This is what, in some ways, we're trying to find a way to investigate that is a very, sort of a familiar idea within psychoanalysis. But I would also like to sort of make sure that it's very important in life to be able to mentalize about others, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine a relationship in which, let's say, you're invested in mentalizing yourself, but you're not invested in mentalizing your partner, right? So it's important to mentalize others. It's important to mentalize yourself. And again, try to make that qualification that mentalizing yourself has to be kind of open and receptive to other people's mentalizing about you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right? So again, it's not an assumption that what other people say is accurate, but I think this is where I would see a link between mentalization and communication, right? That you appreciate that others might have knowledge or a perspective that can be useful to you.
Okay, and
I don't
here's
see
a
it as, that mentalizing is something that one typically does, in the privacy of one's own company.
here's another question. To what extent does this model involve education of the patient about the model itself, or about the importance of affect regulation in general?
Yeah, that's a great question too, because I think I'm inclined to, I think, mentalized affectivity is a mouthful, and I'm aware of it, hoping that it's justified, but, it's very important as a psychotherapist to not be deluded that patients walk through your door wanting to become better mentalizers, right? That's extremely unlikely. So in that sense, I think that it's a matter of, being able in the way you respond to patients, because again, it's certainly not something that just psychodynamic therapists do to mentalize their patient's experience, but really promoting patients mentalizing, right? That I think you can do by just trying to inspire curiosity, and I hope some of my clinical examples, illustrated that.
Another question is, when Dr. Jurist was discussing culture as an influence in understanding emotions, he spoke of emotions as being displayed symbolically. It went too fast for me to take in clearly. Would he say more about what he means about emotions displayed symbolically?
Yeah. Again, this came up in the context of appreciating that I think Freud had a germ of an idea that he did not develop very well in terms of a theory of emotions. The place in which I think Freud is most interesting in the way he talks about emotions is when he's talking about art. For example, his interpretation of Moses, in which he really sees Moses is struggling with affect regulation. But the idea, I think, is that, illustrative of that it's a very justified reason to pursue psychotherapy, to try to live a more creative life in which one experiences well-being, and that has to do, I think, with a project of self-definition, right? I mean, it's sort of, I'm thinking about a kind of parallel between, if you think of like Lawrence Kohlberg's idea of moral development, which, there's a stage beyond that a good life is prescribed for you, and that, that has to be something that is chosen. And I try to illustrate this, especially by referring to Oliver Sacks's work, in which he ends up characterizing multiple people in his life in terms of medals, given his fascination with the periodic table. So it's a way of sort of conceptualizing the representations of these people in some way that I think is facilitative for him. And in particular, I referred to the fact that I think when he was about 18, he divulged to his father that he was gay, and told his father not to tell his mother. His father told his mother, and the mother said something equivalent to, I wish you were never born. So it's a really, really profound rejection. But I think he compares his mother to gold. And there are ways in which, even though one might expect that, his mother's rejection would produce a rejection of her, I think that his mentalized affectivity allowed him to sort of appreciate some things that he was able to get from his mother, and some things which he was not.
Well, we're out of time, and there were a few questions we didn't get to, but I want to encourage people to contact Dr. Jurist directly with questions at the email address you provided.
Yeah.
The webinar will be made available. It's being recorded. And I'll end by thanking you, Elliot, and thanking the Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Studies, Division 39 of APA. Barry Dauphin, the current president, and Dennis Debiak, former president, were very supportive, and we look forward to future seminars. And thank you, all of you, for joining us. And it's been terrific.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just reiterate that if you have asked a question, we will follow up and do our best to give you a response. So thank you for your attention.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.